name's Mason, and today we're going to have a very exciting presentation on intermediate Angular directives. There'll be lots of GIFs and animations, and it'll be lots of fun. So, starting off, the reason I called this intermediate as opposed to advanced directives is, of course, directives go very deep. We at Full Stack in our coursework barely scratch the surface of them. I'm hoping to take us just like one level deeper and just the point where we can understand what's actually going on with them. So the agenda for this talk is role of directives in Angular, and then the majority of it will be spent on the life cycle of a directive. And then if we get to the end, there will be a very funny joke. Directives, are basically Angular's, components. They allow developers to extend their HTML with, custom syntax and functionality. Essentially, they are functions that get executed when Angular finds them in the DOM. Without an ng app, there is no magic that happens. A lot of Angular is just a library of these directives, but it also exposes to us the ability to expand upon this library and gives us a lot of freedom. Okay, so, oh yeah, this is a joke. The reason I kind of chose to do this was because me and I think a lot of people were wondering, what is the difference between the link and the controller function when you define a directive, given that both have access to the scope object, as well as, I think, element and attributes. In order to answer those questions, we're going to talk about the life cycle of a directive, which can roughly be defined by the functions that you can define for a directive. Those are going to be in 3 different phases. First, there's the compile phase, then the controller and prelink phase. Those are grouped together because for each directive, the controller gets called, and then the prelink function, which you might not have heard of, gets called. And then after that, Postlink, which we commonly define as simply link. So the first phase is the compile phase. It's initiated by ng-app, which is, of course, the first directive to get compiled. Basically, what happens is the browser goes through the DOM, and it the Angular script gets hit, and the first thing that Angular does is it listens for basically, I think it's the ready event for the DOM ready event, and it when it hears that, it starts going through the DOM itself and until it finds the ng-app directive, and then once it finds that, it that's the first one it compiles, and then it traverses the rest of the DOM that's contained within the ng-app directive. It traverses the rest of the DOM in a depth-first manner, recursively. And so it starts with parents, goes to children, then to leaf nodes, and then back up to the sibling of the parent, I believe. The thing about the compile phase is once this phase completes, directives can no longer be added or removed from the DOM. Of course, there's an exception where you can use Angular's actual compile service and mess with stuff yourself. So in terms of directives and defining directives, the compile phase lives in the compile function, which gets called, I believe, before the directive gets actually compiled, or it's at that point. And what you would want to do in the compile function is any manipulation to the raw DOM that you might want to do before Angular gets a hold of it and compiles it, turns it into directives, and transcludes things and such. Let's see. So what you should be aware of if you're writing code in the compile function is that any child directives have not been compiled, and so you don't have access to their scopes or anything like that. And commonly what people do when they define the arguments for the compile function is put a T before element and attributes to just remind you that it's the template element and template attributes, i.e. the raw DOM. And yeah. So then we have an example use case from Angular source code, which it actually defines the A tag as a directive, and it uses some of this logic to go through and basically prevent the default event actions from firing when you click on a link tag that doesn't have a hyperlink reference to it. So if you just have href, hash, which is common when you're, using front-end routing as opposed to back-end. Let's see. So then we have the controller and prelink phase. These are the next functions to run, and like I said, they run controller prelink for every directive that is encountered. So the compile function traverses, the DOM that's been selected by ng-app depth first, recursively. Then it comes back out, does it again from starting at the root node, and then for each it calls the controller prelink. And so why are there two functions for this phase rather than one? The purpose of the controller, as opposed to either of the link functions, is to facilitate communication between scopes, basically. And although that the compiled DOM is available, you should not be messing with the DOM after the compile phase, or at least in this phase before the postlink function. Right, I already talked about this. The controller function out of all these four is actually injectable. That's hence the $signs. And all these functions have multiple elements, many of which are the use of which is deprecated by Angular. And so like here, you probably wouldn't want to use element or attributes very much. And then this is how you would require in basically the controllers of parent functions or parent directives or sibling directives. This syntax here with require sibling directive is written like this. Parent directive is 1 caret, and then anything above that, I think, is, maybe it's just the grandparent, is 2 carets, and then you want to give them a question mark if they're optionally required in. And what this does is it gives you access to, in the link function, which is actually the postlink function, it gives you access to a fourth argument, which is which is interesting because it is the controller argument. If you only require in one other directive, then it is the controller for that directive. If you have multiple ones, then it's an array of controllers, which is kind of confusing. But basically, this is what makes it possible to communicate between directives. And so if you wanted to define a method on a parent directive that its children directives could use, and you only wanted to define that method once, this would be a good way to do that. This is just an example I found in the source code of this being used. Basically, what's happening here is there's a directive called ng-change, which requires in ng-models controller and uses that to push listener functions onto ng-models scope, which is kind of cool. So then the prelink function, what use is this? It's not used very often, but what I read was that it should be used to manipulate the scope of a directive privately. So you can't require in the prelink function. You can only require in the controller. So if you have something that you don't want child directives to access, put it in here. Good. Oh yeah. The main purpose of this is, or the reason you would want to make code private like that is if you're distributing your code and expecting other developers to use your directives, which is a normal thing with Angular. Here is our example use case. So this is basically, this is ng-init, and as far as I can tell, it seems to ng-init just seems to be a sort of wrapper for the prelink function. So it gives you access, it lets you, write Angular expressions to be evaluated in a prelink function in the HTML. Let's see. So then we get the postlink phase, which is interesting, I guess, because it's applied backwards from the other phases. It starts with the leaves and then works its way back up to the root, and that is so everything, all the parents have access to their children's scope, I think, but it just makes it so, I don't know, that's the way it does it. Let's see. So everything at this point is hooked up, connected. The children directives and the transclude content are now available. And this is, most of the time, if you write any of these 4 functions, you're writing a link function. That's because it's okay to do sort of everything in it. You have access to the scope, to the compiled elements and the attributes of that compiled element, which is the directive oftentimes. And then you can require in controllers, and this is the only place you're supposed to use the transclude function, which allows you to append content to the directive basically after compilation has happened. It's generally a very confusing function and idea, but the one limitation here, of course, is that you can't use any Angular functions that modify the DOM, because that will destroy any of the changes that you made to them before. Like if you added event listeners to them, this will get rid of those. So you want to make sure to use jQuery selectors for that. This is ng-show. It's using the link function to update the elements that it's attached to with a class that show. In this case, it's a custom sort of animate class, I think. But yeah, this is what ng-show looks like. I think we already talked about this a little bit. I don't think we really have time to go into transclusion sort of stuff, but we can continue. Well, maybe we do. I guess there's a couple more slides. So transclusion is a confusing topic. There's like 3 different kinds of transclusion. But the basic idea is that you want to tell Angular where to include content that you write. Like if you write a custom directive in your HTML and you put some content in there, and that custom directive has a template, and that template is a few nested elements, you want to be able to tell Angular where to actually insert that content in that template. And so in that template, you can use a directive called ng-transclude, which just makes it easy and tells it exactly where to put the content that you write inside that directive in the HTML of the index page. And but you can also use the transclude function and do things yourself. The function is interesting because if you what? Oh, okay, sorry. I didn't time this, and I have no idea. 15. Oh, okay, sorry. This is, just a. This is what I was talking about with the life cycle, and then our joke. The end.